You've heard of John Dillinger, the ruthless gangster, the escape artist, the man who terrorized America in the 1930s. But what if everything you knew about him was only half the story? In this video, we're uncovering the real John Dillinger, the man behind the headlines, the myths, and the mystery. We're solving the question: was Dillinger truly America's public enemy? No, one, or something far more complicated? In the heart of America's darkest days, one name struck fear and fascination into the hearts of millions: John Dillinger. A man who robbed banks with charm, outsmarted lawmen with daring escapes, and lived life on the edge. But was he truly a cold-blooded criminal or a symbol of defiance in a broken system? Today, we uncover the untold story of John Dillinger. America's public enemy? No. 1. The 1930s in America were unlike anything the country had ever seen before. Imagine waking up every morning to headlines filled with despair factories closing, banks collapsing, and families losing everything overnight. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic downturn. It was a national trauma. Millions of Americans found themselves unemployed, lining up at soup kitchens, wondering how they would feed their children. The very institutions that people had trusted, banks, businesses, even the government, suddenly seemed powerless, or worse, indifferent. This was the world John Dillinger was born into, and it shaped everything about his story. See, when times get desperate, people start looking for someone to blame, and sometimes someone to cheer for. That's exactly what happened during this period. On one side, there was rising anger at the bankers and big businesses blamed for the crash. On the other, there was growing frustration with law enforcement, seen as corrupt or incompetent when it came to protecting ordinary citizens. So when headlines began to feature daring criminals taking on the very system people felt betrayed by, something strange happened. These outlaws weren't just feared, they were admired. Not by everyone, of course, but by enough people to turn crime into legend. Gangsters like Bonnie and Clyde, Pretty Boy Floyd, and of course John Dillinger became household names. But here's the thing most people miss: America wasn't just dealing with bad guys running wild. The country itself was transforming. Cities were growing, cars were faster, guns were deadlier, and the FBI was still learning how to be the force it is today. Criminals were using new technologies, getaway cars, machine guns, even disguises, to stay one step ahead. Meanwhile, law enforcement was scrambling, often using outdated tactics that left them humiliated when gangsters slipped through their fingers. And that humiliation only grew when men like Dillinger pulled off escapes that seemed straight out of a Hollywood movie. Think about it. Banks had bars, guards, alarms, and yet Dillinger and his crew could walk in, clean the place out, and vanish before police even knew what happened. For a public beaten down by the Depression, this was shocking, but also thrilling. This was the era when the term public enemy no. 1 inch was born, a label the FBI used to warn the nation about its most dangerous criminals. But here's the twist. The more the government painted Dillinger as a villain, the more fascinated people became. Newspapers printed every detail of his robberies and escapes, sometimes exaggerating the story because, let's face it, a daring outlaw sold more papers than another story about a bank foreclosing on a family farm. And as Dillinger's legend grew, so did the sense that the system itself was being mocked. Banks that people already hated were being robbed, police were being outsmarted, and the headlines read like a crime novel unfolding in real time. It was as if Dillinger represented something bigger than himself, a rebellion against a world where ordinary people felt powerless. But here's what makes this era so important to understand. Dillinger didn't rise in a vacuum. He rose in a country where poverty, anger, and mistrust had reached a boiling point, where small towns were drying up and big cities were buzzing with crime, corruption, and opportunity for anyone bold enough to seize it. This wasn't just about one man's choices. It was about a nation in chaos, a nation where people questioned everything, and where someone like John Dillinger could become both a criminal mastermind and, in the eyes of some, a folk hero. Before John Dillinger became America's public enemy no. 1. Before the bank robberies, the shootouts, and the daring escapes that made headlines nationwide, there was just a boy growing up in Indianapolis, Indiana. A boy who, like so many others in the early 1900s, lived in a world defined by hard work, strict family values, and a rapidly changing America. But behind the closed doors of his family home and in the dusty streets of his neighborhood, the seeds of rebellion, restlessness, and defiance were already being planted. John Herbert Dillinger was born on June 22, 1903, to John Wilson Dillinger and Mary Ellen Lancaster. His father was a grocer, a man known for his discipline and stern approach to life. His mother was the softer presence in the household, but tragedy struck early. Mary Ellen died when John was just a few years old. That loss would haunt him, leaving him with a deep sense of emptiness and a childhood that felt incomplete. The boy who would one day make the entire nation tremble was, at his core, a lonely child looking for a sense of belonging. As John grew older, he became known for two things: his charm and his mischief. He wasn't the kind of kid who followed the rules quietly. Teachers remembered him as bright but distracted, clever but restless. School bored him, authority annoyed him, and he had a knack for getting into trouble. He wasn't violent or cruel, but he had that spark, the kind of energy that either gets channeled into something great or spins wildly out of control. For John Dillinger, it became the latter. When his father remarried, hoping to bring stability to the household, young John didn't adjust well. His relationship with his father grew strained. The old man believed in discipline, hard work, and staying out of trouble, while John seemed drawn to excitement, risk, and independence. It was like watching two forces collide under one roof. Eventually, his father moved the family out to a farm in Mooresville, Indiana, hoping the fresh air and hard labor would straighten his son out. But country life only seemed to make John feel more trapped, more determined to break free from the expectations closing in around him. By his teenage years, Dillinger was already drifting toward the wrong crowd. He had friends who liked to drink, gamble, and fight, and he quickly developed a reputation as a boy who could charm anyone but couldn't stay out of trouble. There are stories of him stealing cars for joyrides, pulling small pranks that edged into petty crimes, and constantly looking for ways to stir up excitement in a town that offered him none. The thing was, Dillinger wasn't just reckless, he was smart. He learned fast, adapted quickly, and had the kind of charisma that made people want to follow him, even back then. But his father saw the path he was headed down and tried to intervene. He warned John about the dangers of his choices, lectured him about responsibility, even arranged for talks with local ministers to set him straight. None of it worked. The more people told John what to do, the more determined he became to do the opposite. It wasn't long before small mischief turned into real crime. At 20 years old, John married a teenager named Beryl Hovius, perhaps looking for stability or maybe just another form of escape, but marriage didn't slow him down. Only months later, in 1924, he attempted his first real robbery at a local grocery store. It was poorly planned, a spur-of-the-moment decision fueled by desperation and adrenaline. He was caught almost immediately. The judge threw the book at him, and John Dillinger was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison for a crime that, in today's world, might have carried a far lighter sentence. But here's where fate stepped in. That prison term, intended to punish and reform him, instead became his education in crime. Inside the Indiana State Prison, Dillinger met seasoned bank robbers, hardened criminals who taught him the tricks of the trade. Men like Harry Pierpont and Homer Van Meter, who would later become his partners in crime, were his mentors behind bars. It was here that the small-town troublemaker transformed into the man who would soon terrorize banks and lawmen across the Midwest. And all of it started because a young man from Indiana felt out of place in his own life, pushed by circumstance, loss, and rebellion into the arms of a criminal world that promised him excitement, power, and freedom he couldn't find anywhere else. When John Dillinger finally walked out of prison in May 1933, he wasn't the same young man who had gone in almost a decade earlier. Prison had hardened him, sharpened him, and most importantly, connected him with men who would become his partners in one of the most daring crime waves in American history. He walked out with a plan, a network, and a burning determination to never again be powerless. And almost immediately, he put those lessons to work. The country he stepped into was still gripped by the Great Depression. Banks were hated institutions, seen as the villains of everyday people's misery. Families were losing homes, farms were being foreclosed, and resentment toward the financial system was at an all-time high. So when John Dillinger started targeting banks, it wasn't just about money. To some people, it felt like revenge against the system. Every time Dillinger hit a bank, the story spread like wildfire across newspapers. And for a public struggling to survive, there was a strange thrill in seeing someone stick it to the very institutions they blamed for their suffering. Dillinger's first series of robberies came fast and fearless. In June 1933, just weeks after leaving prison, he robbed his first bank in New Carlisle, Ohio, walking away with thousands of dollars. He planned his jobs meticulously, studying banks, learning guard schedules, timing everything down to the second. Yet he carried himself with an ease and charm that stunned witnesses. There were reports of him smiling at tellers, tipping his hat, even joking during robberies. One story claimed that during a heist, he looked at a trembling customer and calmly said, "We're here for the bank's money, not yours," reassuring ordinary people while emptying the vault. But while Dillinger was becoming a legend, law enforcement was struggling to keep up. Local police departments weren't equipped to handle criminals with fast cars, automatic weapons, and military-style planning. Dillinger and his gang used high-powered cars like the Ford V8, which could outrun almost any police vehicle of the time. They carried Thompson's Tommy guns that gave them firepower far beyond what small-town officers could bring to a fight. Every robbery embarrassed law enforcement further, making Dillinger seem untouchable. By September 1933, Dillinger had been arrested in Dayton, Ohio, but even jail couldn't hold him for long. While he sat behind bars, members of his new gang, including Harry Pierpont and Charles Mackley, launched a daring assault on the prison where Dillinger was being held, freeing him in a storm of gunfire. It was bold, it was reckless, and it was only the beginning. With his gang assembled, Dillinger's crime spree turned into something the country had never seen before. Between October 1933 and mid-1934, they robbed over a dozen banks across Indiana, Wisconsin, and beyond, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Each heist was bigger, riskier, and more dramatic than the last. In Racine, Wisconsin, they used hostages as human shields to escape police gunfire. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, they shot their way out when officers surprised them mid-robbery. It was chaos, it was violent, and it was splashed across front pages nationwide. But it wasn't just the robberies that built Dillinger's legend, it was the escapes. In January 1934, Dillinger and several gang members were cornered in Tucson, Arizona, after a fire broke out in their hotel, exposing their location. They were arrested, but Dillinger didn't panic. A month later, in March, he famously escaped from the supposedly escape-proof Crown Point jail in Indiana using what many believe was a wooden gun, carved and painted to look real. He bluffed his way past guards, locked them in a cell, and stole the sheriff's car to make his getaway. It was humiliating for law enforcement and electrifying for the public. Newspapers couldn't get enough of the story. Was it really a wooden gun? Was it smuggled in? No one knew for sure, and the mystery only made Dillinger more famous. As the months went on, Dillinger and his gang lived fast and dangerously. They partied in Chicago, hid out in Wisconsin's Northwoods, and shot their way out of police traps more than once. Safe houses known as gangster hideouts became part of the lore, places where Dillinger and his men could vanish after a job while authorities scrambled to find them. But with every headline, every daring escape, the pressure grew. The newly reorganized FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was taking things personally. Dillinger wasn't just another criminal, he was becoming a symbol of lawlessness that Hoover needed to crush to prove his agency as power. The chase was on, and both sides knew it was building toward a violent showdown neither could walk away from unchanged. By the spring of 1934, John Dillinger wasn't just another outlaw on the run, he was a full-blown national obsession. His name was splashed across every newspaper. His face stared out from wanted posters in post offices and police stations across the country, and his story was told and retold in every cafe, barbershop, and living room in America. People didn't just know about Dillinger. They were captivated by him. Some feared him, some hated him, and some in secret admired him. But the one thing no one could do was ignore him. The media played a massive role in shaping the legend of John Dillinger. Every robbery, every narrow escape, every shootout was turned into front-page news. Reporters described him with words like daring, bold, and fearless. He was painted as a criminal mastermind, a man who could slip through police dragnets like smoke through a keyhole. There were stories about his charm, how he treated hostages kindly, how he joked with bank tellers even as he cleaned out their vaults. Some claimed he was like a modern-day Robin Hood, though in reality, he didn't give his stolen money to the poor, he used it to fund the gang-ass hideouts, cars, and lavish parties. But when people are desperate for heroes in hard times, they sometimes blur the line between outlaw and legend. And then came the label that would cement his place in history, Public Enemy No. 1. J. Edgar Hoover, the ambitious head of the newly renamed Federal Bureau of Investigation, was determined to prove that his agency could handle modern crime. Dillinger, with his string of robberies and escapes, had embarrassed law enforcement too many times. Hoover needed a victory, something to show that the FBI could take on the most dangerous criminals in the country and win. So in June 1934, the FBI officially declared John Dillinger Public Enemy No. 1, the first time the title had ever been used. It was more than just a label. It was a declaration of war. From that moment on, Dillinger wasn't just a fugitive. He was the face of lawlessness in America, the man Hoover had to bring down at any cost. Federal agents poured resources into the hunt. They traced his friends, his family, anyone who might give them a lead. They raided safe houses, chased rumors, and followed him across state lines, something local police couldn't legally do at the time. The FBI even armed its agents with more powerful weapons, determined to match the firepower Dillinger's gang carried in their Tommy guns and sawed-off shotguns. But the more the FBI chased him, the more his legend grew. Stories of Dillinger's escapes spread faster than the truth. One tale claimed he had plastic surgery to change his face. Another said he had his fingerprints burned off with acid to avoid identification. Whether these stories were true or not didn't matter, the public ate them up, and Dillinger became larger than life. At the same time, the man himself was living like there was no tomorrow. He hid out in Chicago, staying in safe houses run by underworld figures who were paid handsomely to keep him protected. He spent time with women, threw money around freely, and acted like someone who believed he could stay one step ahead of the law forever. But the walls were closing in. In April 1934, Dillinger was involved in a violent shootout at the Little Bohemia Lodge in Wisconsin after the FBI, acting on a tip, raided what they thought was his hideout. The raid was a disaster for the Bureau. Agents killed innocent civilians, Dillinger escaped yet again, and Hoover was humiliated. But the shootout marked a turning point. The FBI was learning, adapting, getting closer each time, and Dillinger's gang was running out of places to hide. Still, even as the noose tightened, Dillinger's name dominated the headlines. To some, he was a cold-blooded killer responsible for the deaths of police officers and federal agents. To others, he was a symbol of defiance in an America where banks were the enemy and lawmen were often seen as corrupt. The truth was more complicated. Dillinger was neither a noble rebel nor a mindless thug. He was a man who thrived in chaos, a criminal who understood how to turn fear, speed, and audacity into weapons as powerful as any machine gun. And yet, the more powerful his legend grew, the more determined the FBI became to end it. Hoover knew his agency's reputation was on the line. Bringing down John Dillinger wasn't just about stopping a criminal, it was about proving that no one, no matter how daring or cunning, could outsmart the federal government forever. By the summer of 1934, the chase for John Dillinger had turned into the most intense manhunt America had ever seen. The FBI, newly armed and desperate to prove its power, was done being humiliated by a man who seemed to vanish every time they got close. And Dillinger knew it. He could feel the walls closing in, the air getting heavier with each passing day. But he wasn't the type to back down or run quietly. He lived like a man who believed he had 9 lives, moving through safe houses, slipping across state lines, changing hideouts like most people change clothes. Yet for all his charm, cunning, and daring escapes, even Dillinger couldn't outrun the one thing that brings down so many legends: betrayal. The FBI was under enormous pressure from J. Edgar Hoover himself. This wasn't just about catching a criminal anymore, it was about saving face. Dillinger had made the Bureau look like amateurs when he escaped Crown Point Jail, supposedly using nothing more than a wooden gun. He had shot his way out of traps, outsmarted agents, and turned himself into a national celebrity while Hoover's men kept coming up empty-handed. Hoover needed a win, and he needed it fast. So the FBI started turning to informants, people inside Dillinger's world who could be tempted by money, fear, or revenge. And that's where the story takes its darkest turn. Enter Anna Sage, a Romanian immigrant living in Chicago, known around the city as the Woman in Red. She wasn't really a woman in red at all. She worked as a madam running brothels and had her own troubles with the law, including the threat of deportation. She moved in the same underworld circles as Dillinger, knew people who knew him, and soon she became the key the FBI had been looking for. Dillinger, at this point, was still living fast despite the danger. He had a girlfriend, Polly Hamilton, and he still moved around Chicago with a kind of reckless confidence. He even went to the movies, strolled through the city acting like the FBI wasn't right on his heels. But Anna Sage saw an opportunity. Facing deportation and hoping for a deal with the authorities, she made a choice that would change everything. She told the FBI she could lead them to Dillinger if they promised to help her stay in the country. Whether she made the deal out of fear, anger, or pure self-preservation, no one knows for sure. But the Bureau agreed, setting the stage for one of the most famous betrayals in American history. On July 22, 1934, Anna told the FBI that Dillinger planned to take Polly to see a movie at the Biograph Theater in Chicago. The film was Manhattan melodrama, a gangster picture that, in hindsight, feels almost too fitting for what was about to happen. The plan was simple. Agents would surround the theater, wait until Dillinger came out, and take him down before he had a chance to run. Anna agreed to wear an orange skirt that looked red under the lights so agents could identify her in the crowd. That's how she became forever known as the Lady in Red, even though the real color of the dress was different. As evening fell, Dillinger arrived at the theater with Polly and Anna. He bought his ticket, walked inside, and for the next 2 hours, as Clark Gable lit up the screen, federal agents took their positions outside. The air was thick with tension. They knew Dillinger was armed. They knew he wouldn't go quietly. Every passerby, every noise, every shadow made the agents twitch. This was their chance to end the chase that had consumed the country for over a year. When the movie ended and Dillinger stepped out into the warm Chicago night, Anna walked beside him just as planned. The agents closed in, guns ready, hearts pounding. Dillinger spotted them at the last moment. Some witnesses said he reached for his gun, others claimed he tried to run toward an alley. In seconds, the night exploded with gunfire. Dillinger was hit multiple times before collapsing onto the pavement outside the Biograph Theater. The crowd screamed, people scattered, and just like that, the man who had outsmarted police, robbed banks in broad daylight, and escaped from jails thought to be inescapable lay dying on a Chicago sidewalk. The FBI had their victory, Hoover had his headline, and the legend of John Dillinger was sealed forever not by the bullets alone, but by the betrayal that led him there. The night John Dillinger fell outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago was supposed to mark the end of the story. The FBI declared victory, newspapers across the country ran bold headlines, and J. Edgar Hoover held it up as proof that no criminal could outwit his newly empowered bureau. Dillinger was gone, the chase was over, and the so-called public enemy one was finally off the streets. But if history has shown us anything, it's that legends don't end with the last gunshot. Sometimes, that's when they truly begin. Almost immediately after Dillinger's death, people started asking questions. The FBI claimed they had gotten their man, but rumors swirled that the body lying on that Chicago sidewalk wasn't Dillinger at all. Witnesses argued about the details. Some swore Dillinger had different colored eyes than the man killed that night. Others pointed to scars or fingerprints that didn't seem to match. Even the shape of the corpse's face fueled speculation. Could the FBI, desperate for a win, have taken down the wrong man? The government, of course, denied all of it. They said fingerprints confirmed it was Dillinger beyond a doubt. They released photos of his body to the press, showing the lifeless face of the man who had once terrified lawmen across the Midwest. But conspiracy theories have a way of digging in deep, especially when a story captures the imagination of an entire nation. Some people claim Dillinger had planned the whole thing, that he staged his own death with a look-alike, so he could disappear and live out his life in peace. Over the years, alleged sightings of Dillinger popped up everywhere: California, Mexico, even as far as South America. None were ever proven, but the whispers refused to die. Part of the reason Dillinger's story lingered was because he wasn't just seen as a criminal, he had become a symbol. To the FBI, he represented lawlessness, the chaos of the gangster era, and the need for modern policing. To many ordinary Americans, especially those beaten down by the Great Depression, he was something else entirely, a man who took on the banks they despised, who lived fast, laughed in the face of danger, and died young in a blaze of bullets. Whether people loved him or hated him, they couldn't stop talking about him. Hollywood, of course, couldn't resist either. Within months of his death, movies and pulp magazines were dramatizing his life, sometimes turning him into a cold-blooded villain, other times painting him as a tragic anti-hero. Over the decades, Dillinger has been played by actors like Warren Oates and Johnny Depp, each version reshaping his image for a new generation. Was he a heartless killer, or was he a rebellious outlaw who became a victim of his own fame? The answer seems to change depending on who tells the story. But beyond the movies and myths, there's a reason Dillinger's name still echoes through history. His crime spree directly led to major changes in law enforcement. The FBI used his case to push for better weapons, stronger laws, and the ability to cross state lines in pursuit of criminals. Before Dillinger, federal agents didn't even carry guns. After Dillinger, the FBI was transformed into the powerful agency we know today. In a strange way, the man who defied the law helped shape it into something far more formidable than he could have imagined. And yet, for all the facts we know, the dates, the robberies, the shootouts, there's something about Dillinger that refuses to be pinned down. Maybe it's because he embodied a contradiction, a criminal who smiled at witnesses, a killer who became a folk hero, a man who lived in the shadows but ended up in the spotlight. Or maybe it's because we can't resist a mystery, and Dillinger left us with plenty. From the rumors of his survival to the debates over his motives, he remains a puzzle that history never fully solved. Even today, decades after that night outside the Biograph Theater, people still visit Dillinger's grave in Indianapolis. Some leave flowers. Others leave coins or notes as if paying tribute not to the man he was, but to the legend he became. And every so often, new theories emerge, new claims that maybe, just maybe, the FBI didn't tell us the whole story. Because the truth about John Dillinger isn't just in the facts written in police files or newspaper archives. It lives in the questions that still haunt us, the stories passed down, the blurred line between man and myth that keeps his name alive long after the last shot was fired. And so, the story of John Dillinger comes full circle. From a restless young boy in Indiana to the man who robbed banks with charm and defiance, outsmarted lawmen time and again, and became the first ever public enemy. 1. Dillinger's life burned bright and fast against the backdrop of a desperate America. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a product of his time, shaped by the Great Depression, fueled by public anger at banks and institutions, and immortalized by a press that couldn't get enough of his daring escapes and headline-grabbing heists. But behind the legend was a man who lived on the edge until the very last moment, betrayed by someone he trusted and brought down in a storm of gunfire that ended an era of gangster folklore. Yet even in death, Dillinger refused to fade away. Conspiracy theories, Hollywood movies, and unanswered questions have kept his name alive for nearly a century, turning him from a mere outlaw into a symbol of rebellion, mystery, and the thin line between fact and legend. John Dillinger may have died on that Chicago sidewalk, but his story never truly ended. It lives on in history books, in whispered rumors, in the myth of the man who defied the law and, for a time, made the whole nation watch in awe.